This is Linux Sucks for the year of our Lord 2020. And this is the first time that I've done this show, this almost yearly show, without an audience. And it feels really wicked weird. Normally I'm at a podium or at a lectern or on a stage or somewhere. Sometimes it's a small audience, sometimes it's a big hall full of people. It's varied, but there's always someone in the audience for me to talk to, for me to ask questions of, for me to interact with. And you can hear when people are laughing or groaning or going, "Oh, Lunduke, that's a ridiculous idea," or something. And inevitably there's hecklers, right? And most years that there's hecklers, they're people that I've become friends with. This is a very real thing. So one of my favorite hecklers is a guy that works over on the Fedora project. And for not every year, but I would say, I don't know, maybe like at least 5 or 6 of the years I've done Linux Sucks, he's been in the audience near the front row, and he'll just shout out, "You're wrong about that." And I eventually took to the point where I just called him Fedora, and I'd be like, "Shut up, Fedora," and I can't tell him to shut up anymore, and that really bums me out. In a friendly way. I shut up in a friendly way, and it bums me out that he's not going to be there. I kind of wish he was at least here, sitting on the other side of my camera, so he could like glare at me when I get something technically wrong, and I could be like, "Can it? Zip it?" But I can't do that. There's no audience. But what I've decided to do is to do this all in one take. No edits, as if I was on a stage giving a live show. So if I screw things up along the way, that's just going to be part of the show. I'm not going to edit it out. I'm not going to overdub anything. I'm not going to cut things together. No. What you see is what you get. This is the show that would have been live, except, well, there's no audience because of the friggin' stupid virus thingy. Anyway, it's a little bit of a bummer. One of the other things that I'm kind of bummed out about, because this is one of my favorite parts about doing shows with an audience, is I get to ask people things. Like, so I have a tendency to be like, to get off on a train of thought. And I'll be talking about Linux sucks because of X, Y, and Z. And then I'll get a thought. I'm like, how many people use this thing? And I'll be like, how many people use this desktop or whatever? I'm like, raise your hands. And, people will raise their hands or not. And some people will chuckle. And it's kind of fun to like interact with people that way. It's a great casual way to just chat and goof and kind of rib each other a little bit. And we can't do that right now. So if you're sitting at home, and you are, if you could pretend like you're heckling me a little bit, that probably will help a great deal. Before we go too much further, I would like to point out that every slide in this slide deck, because this is a presentation, like you're at a tech conference, right? Slide decks and all. I've got 50 or 60 or whatever slides in this deck, and every single one of them, not joking, is 160 by 90 pixels. Yeah, 160 by 90. Why? Why did I choose that particular resolution? Because those are all the pixels I need to make my point. Just saying, I don't need some fancy HD 1080p set of pixels in order to make the point that Linux sucks. I just need 160 by 90. Plus, that makes it 16 by 9 in aspect ratio, which makes it scale up to like 720p or 1080 really easily. Anyway, so that I just would like to point that out. It's just a fun little bit. All right, so before we get to my reasons why Linux sucks, right? My things that I'm really just irked about this year. I would be remiss if I did not point out that Linux has a lot of bugs and a ton of design issues. And when I'm talking about Linux, I'm talking about desktop Linux computers, right? I'm talking about Linux on your PC, on your tower, on your laptop, those sorts of things. Using whatever desktop environment you choose at this time, whether it's GNOME or Ubuntu or whatever, right? There's lots of bugs. There's lots of issues. There's tons of things we can just go through list after list and be like, this thing is broken. Ha ha ha. This thing is broken. We're not going to do that. We are going to touch on a couple of topics that are real kind of more technical designy topics, but we're not going to get into the down and dirty of talking about all the various little bugs and things that we all want to hit. There's a lot of those. There's too many of those to list. We're going to go from a little bit of a higher level today because there are some things within the broader Linux world that just suck a whole lot. And I really want to touch on those. We need to tackle these things now. And so that's what we're going to be hitting today. If you do not already subscribe to something relating to the Lunduke Journal, I highly recommend it. It's all really free. Just go to lunduke.com. There's articles and there's comic strips now and podcasts and videos and all sorts of things on the YouTubes and the libraries and the all sorts of stuff. We talk about old technology, old computers, retro stuff, new technology, lots of Linux, lots of open source. Go check it out. It's the bee's knees, if you please. And this show, Linux Sucks, just like everything I do with the Lunduke Journal, has two basic rules. Real simple. Number one, no swearing, right? And I define swearing sort of like if you're a cowboy and you walk into a church, what language would you be allowed to say without getting in a whole lot of trouble from whoever's running that there church? So no swearing. The point there is that we want families to be able to enjoy this stuff together. We want you to be able to play everything that I create, including Linux Sucks, even though it has sucks in the title, which some people might view as a little bit of a swear word. But I want you to be able to play it at work or at school or in front of your family or whoever. It's an important thing. Everything from here on out is very low PG or high G. It's like right in that straddling line. Second rule, real simple, be excellent to each other. So I've got a lot of criticisms as George Costanza's dad in Seinfeld was wont to say when it was time for Festivus, I got a lot of problems with you people and I'm going to tell you about them. That's kind of what's about to happen here. But the goal is to do it in an excellent way. We're going to try not to be mean about it, but I got some issues, and I got to air these issues. I also would like to thank Linode. Linode helps make everything at the Lunduke Journal possible, including Linux Sucks here. They help support like so many different like podcasts and Linux and open source and tech conferences and so much in the community. That's just truly awesome. Plus, they have a little Linux Sucks special. So they're giving away $60 in free cloud hosting credit. If you go to linode.com/Lunduke, you can set up your own MUD, set up a WordPress blog, set up a Kubernetes cluster, whatever you want. A MUD, a Kubernetes cluster, kind of the same thing, right? Just set up the account by June 30th at that URL, and you get a $60 worth of credits, 60 smackers of hosting. That's pretty rad. All right, so let's dive into this. Linux on servers. We're going to talk about Linux on servers ever so briefly because we kind of already won that. That's not all that interesting. Winning is very boring. I've lost track of how big the market share is that we have on the server side. It's huge. I mean, Debian and Ubuntu and Red Hat Enterprise and SUSE Linux Enterprise and CentOS and all these other different distributions and variations of Linux-based systems, they are just dominating the server space. And where they don't dominate, like the cousins of Linux, like the FreeBSDs and NetBSDs and OpenBSDs, they kind of pick up the rest of the slack. And then Windows is over here. And they're like, we have servers too. Like, no, you really don't. And they're like, yeah, we do. Like, no, you really don't. So Linux has already won that space. And while there are problems, because there's always problems, and while there's bugs, there's always bugs, we won, all right? That's boring. It's boring to talk about, so we're just going to move on. Everything we're talking about from here onward has nothing to do with Linux on the servers, at least not really. We're going to focus on Linux on the desktop for a little bit here. Likewise, we're not going to talk a lot about mobile devices because Linux on mobile devices is quite possibly the saddest thing ever in terms of like technology, right? Like it is just the saddest bit of computinginess that's out there right now. And what I mean by that is that Linux dominates mobile too, technically, because Android dominates mobile, and underpinning Android is Linux. Linux is the kernel underneath it. The thing is, that operating system, when you look at it and compare it to what we have on desktops or servers, it is an almost unrecognizable beast. And it is filled with DRM and closed source, and it just is not Linux. It's not regular Linux. It's not GNU/Linux or GNU plus Linux. It's not any of that stuff. And so when you use Linux on mobile, it kind of makes you sad when you're talking to Android. Now there are many efforts underway to have Linux phones, actual hardware that run Linux, right? Variations on Debian and all sorts of stuff. And those are fantastic, but those are like this much market share, right? It's the tiniest market share imaginable. And will that hopefully change? Yes. In fact, I would love to be up here. I'm talking like I'm at a conference still. I would like to be at a conference giving Linux Sucks 2021 and talking about all the problems Linux has on phones, because it's now relevant. Because we've gotten, whether it's the Pine phone or the Librem 5 or what have you, we have multiple Linux phones, hopefully having a good level of success. I would love that. But right now, Linux is winning the mobile phone space in the saddest possible way. And that sucks so much. I hate it. So we're winning on the server. We're winning on mobile, albeit sadly. And we're just not going to talk about mobile or server anymore. I just can't do it. I'm going to focus all the rest of the time on desktops. And the thing is, Linux is not winning on the desktop. Winning on server, check. Winning on mobile, double check. Ugh, sad checks, though, like frowny face checks, like check. Winning on the desktop, no. And follow me on this into journey through graphs and numbers land. Here's a nice graph. Again, it's 160 pixels by 90 pixels, but I still worked in a graph. This is the current market share right now of Windows, Mac, and Linux. You might notice that some platforms have a higher market share than Linux does. Now, so many people are screaming at their screens right now. I wish you were here in person so you could scream at me directly. But here's the thing. These numbers have been either consistent or for Linux slowly dropping. If you look at the numbers, and there's not a lot of great ways to get Linux market share numbers. There really aren't. These numbers here are like, best guess, throw a couple darts at the dartboard, and maybe we're close, right? The methodology for getting these numbers is really flawed. We do it through things like Net Market Watch and GStat Counter and multiple other places that track like web browsers and operating systems and types of devices used to access websites, right? And it tracks them, and then you can see those stats over time, month on month. So it's not so much interesting to look at from the point of view of what is our absolute market value, because we're not going to get there with these numbers. We're just not. But we can get our general ballpark and see trends over time. And those trends can be influenced by a lot of things. Perhaps people spoofing their browser identities, their browser user agents to pretend to be something else so that they get better compatibility with a website. That's a thing. A lot of Linux users do that. I mean, I don't think most, but a lot of them do. But just the same, if that's the case, it doesn't really matter, because what we're looking at really here is Windows at closing in on 80% market share, Mac at close to 20% market share, and Linux scooping up the bottom of the barrel at 1.6. This is from, I believe, GStat Counter. And if you look at the other things like Net Market Share Counter, the market share for Linux has slowly gone down for the last 2.5 years. Yeah, 2 years of just slowly going down, right? And they've seen little spikes here and there, but those spikes always drop back off and slowly over time down. It's not great. It's not great. In fact, if you look at this graph, Linux doesn't have enough market share in this graph to fill up an entire first row of pixels. It's only got like 5 or 6 pixels filled in on that first bottom row. It's pitiful looking. Whereas Mac market share has been on the rise. It's been on the rise, not Linux market share. So while a lot of us have like looked at Windows 10, right? And said, Windows 10, Microsoft made a really crummy operating system. Bah, let's take advantage of that. Well, we didn't. But Apple did. Apple did. Apple's market share went up demonstrably. Microsoft Windows market share went down. Not a ton, but it went down. And Linux market share, at best, it stayed stagnant, depending on which source you look at. And at worst, it's down like 30% over the last 2 years. That's not great. That's not great at all. But now we need to compare that with other stats, right? You can't just take those highly dubious stats and just let it be at that. So let's look at search interest. Yeah, you know how Google tracks this stuff? Not a big Google fan, but you know, if you go to their page, not their page rank, whatever it is, their search interest thing. This is where it's handy to have an audience, because someone would just shout it out at me what it's called. I don't remember things, but they track search interest over time. So you can type in the word Linux and see, okay, what's the page ranking for that? If you look back at 2004, the year 2004, 16 years ago, that was the high point in interest in searching for the word Linux or Linux plus other things. 2006, it was about half that. So about 2 years later, it had dropped down to about half. Here in 2020, it is so low, not only does it not fill up the first bar of pixels there, it's like only 3 pixels in. Like it's got maybe half that bar is full. Is that about half? Probably about half. Oh, holy moly. Now, to be fair, though, it did most of that dropping off before 2020 hit, right? It was not long after 2006. I mean, it kept going down. It was almost every year. It was just keep going down, and it kind of leveled off, and it's just been doing excuse me, it's just been doing slow declines since then, and that is really sad. Now, a lot of people will point out, rightly, if you do the same sort of queries to see what is Windows or Mac OS or iOS or Android, what has other things done? Other things have not done great, right? So like you haven't seen spikes for Windows searching going up, right? You just haven't seen that. You have seen more significant in that period of time growth around searching for Macintoshes, Mac OS, things like that. But still, you saw some drop off, especially over the last couple of years. But none of them have dropped as much overall as Linux has in terms of search interest. None of them. And none of them have dropped quite as low in general as the search interest of Linux. That's not great, right? That's not great. Now, a lot of people, myself included, want to be like, well, this is bupkis, right? This is not fantastic data sets. These could be interpreted a bunch of different ways. Statistics, blah, blah, blah. Statistics, damn lies and statistics, or whatever it is, right? So you'll try and fight against that. But the reality is, if this were flipped and we were seeing the same results happening with Mac OS or specifically with Windows, we would be shouting from the rooftop, we've won. Look at how Windows is dying. We would say that Windows was dying if these numbers happened to Windows. We would say that it was possibly close to dead if this was happening to Windows. If this was happening to Mac OS, we would say Mac OS is dying. This is just proof that Apple has done a bad job. We would say that. There would be articles on every major tech publication talking about the death of that platform if those numbers were for Windows or Mac. Same is true if it was for Android or iOS. Same deal. If people stop looking for it, and people are only, if your user share, if your market share can't fill up the first bottom line of pixels, and it's going down, and the search interest can't fill up half of a bottom line of pixels, and it's going down, that's not good, guys. That's really, really not good. Desktop Linux is, whether you and me like it or not, currently dying a slow death. we just haven't realized it yet. It hasn't sunken in. It's still just sitting there, and we're fighting against it. And many of you will say, well, I'm not using Linux because it's popular, so this doesn't matter to me. I'm like, okay, that's totally fine. That's a really, really reasonable stance to take. I take that stance. It's a reasonable stance, but it's still happening. And again, this does not apply to servers or mobile platforms. Not at all. I'm drinking soda, so now I'm going to burp. Now I'm going to burp. See, now it's a live show. I'm drinking soda and burping. That's how you know this is a live show. So here's a metaphor. We've got a penguin in a frying pan at 160 by 90 pixels, which is a metaphor for something. But yeah, that doesn't happen. That sort of decline does not happen unless the platform sucks. That's just the truth of the matter. That's just how it goes, right? And here are just some of the reasons why Linux sucks so badly that it is currently penguin in the frying panning. That should be a thing, the penguin in the frying pan. But first, before I lay out to you the reasons why I think Linux sucks the most right now, here are the reasons that Linux does not suck. What follows are the non-reasons, right? The reasons Linux sucks, did Linux sucks because of these reasons? No, not at all. The first non-reason that Linux sucks would be Ubuntu. Does Ubuntu itself kind of suck? Yeah. Yeah, it does. Is it worthy of being mocked and ridiculed? Yes, 100%. But it's also a quality operating system put together by a dedicated team of extremely talented and well-meaning people. That's also true. And Ubuntu itself is not the cause for that continual downward drop of Linux desktop market share. We could make arguments about how they could have done things better. We could make many arguments about how perhaps Ubuntu and Canonical shouldn't have started so many projects only to kill them as soon as they started to get kind of sort of stable. That just seems to be their way. But that doesn't hurt overall Linux, right? Fedora, and OpenSUSE, and Arch, they're not hurting because Ubuntu created Upstart or Mir or Unity or any of these things. They're not hurting because of those. Not really. The only one that hurts because of any of that is Ubuntu and Ubuntu users. And that doesn't really destroy overall Linux. So that's not a reason. That is not a reason that Linux sucks. And while we're talking about Arch, another non-reason number 2 is Gentoo and Arch. Is Arch infuriating? Yep. Do Arch users talk about being Arch users too much? Are they basically the vegans of the Linux world? Yes, we know this. It's a common dad joke that gets thrown around all the time. It's like, how do you know an Arch user? Because he told you. Like, of course, that's fine, and that's fun to poke at. But you know what? Again, Arch is a quality system. I managed to say that. And Gentoo is just absolute and utter garbage. So but the user share. I feel bad for making fun of Gentoo because it has its place. It's just, ugh. But neither one of those is taking down Linux, right? The user share of Arch and Gentoo within the broader Linux market share is just this tiny little sliver. So the impact that Arch and Gentoo can have on overall Linux market share or overall Linux success is incredibly minor. Incredibly minor. So many people are throwing things at the screen right now. Non-reason number 3, Systemd. I want to take a moment here. If you're watching the audio version of this, notice there's that little logo right there, a little circle and like a little like a rewind slowly logo. I don't even know exactly what they're doing there. But that is the logo for Systemd. Bet you didn't know that the Systemd had a logo. It does. It's a brackets with a circle and a left pointing triangle. I don't know what it means. I was looking around trying to find what the Systemd logo meant. Couldn't find it. But it's fine. I like square brackets. So it's cool. We're cool. So, okay. Okay, so System D. Does System D annoy me? The answer is yes. The answer is unequivocally yes. It is too un-Unixy. It's not my preferred way of having an init script. It's not my preferred way of starting up a system. But is it destroying Linux? No. And can I not use it? Well, I can not use it, at least for now. But as time goes on, that option will slowly erode and become less of an actual option. But even then, when it gets to the point where it's almost impossible to use any desktop environment unless you also have System D on your system, which is happening, will System D figure more prominently in me talking about why Linux sucks? Yes, it undeniably will. But right now, it doesn't really register on the radar of problems. Like, if I were to rank System D somewhere in the why Linux sucks list of things, it's way past the teens. We're talking maybe item number 73 is System D, right? It's just not worth being too concerned about. Also, games. Right? People talk about games. Still, here we are in 2020. We've got Steam and we've got all these games. We've got GOG.com and we've got so many game distribution platforms that are working on Linux, at least to a certain degree, with high-profile AAA titles. Maybe not all of them, but a lot of them. And we have them on Linux with good performance. We could argue about a little bit of frame rate here or there, but the reality is Linux is a good gaming platform, has been for a couple of years now. I mean, really. I mean, we're not talking just the fact that I can play, I don't know, Frozen Bubble and Super Tux Kart, right? We're talking about I can sit down and play Ark and Civilization 6 and all these other games. There's tons and tons and tons and tons of games that I can play on Linux right now, and they're fantastic. Linux is a modern gaming platform. The reality is there's no platform out there that has all of every game. Windows would be the closest because it's been in that market dominant position for so long. But clearly, Windows market dominance is declining and Mac OS is picking up the slack because we're not doing it. But that does mean that over time, we're going to see less and less games that are for Windows but not other things, right? Because game publishers want to get their games out there far and wide. In the old days of, let's say, like the 80s, there were a million different computer platforms, right? So when, let's say, you're Sierra Online and you want to release a new Space Quest or King's Quest game, do you release it for IBM compatible PCs running DOS? Yes, you do. Do you release it maybe for the Apple II GS or something like that, or an Apple IIc? Yes, you do. Do you release it for a Commodore 64 or a Commodore Amiga? Or possibly, you got to at least consider it. And like, you start to think it through. Maybe some of the higher end Atari home computers of the time. Yeah, maybe a Macintosh. Yeah, you start coming through, and there's a lot of different platforms. And so back then, people released their games for a wide variety of platforms, and some had more games than others, and some had some games that were great, and some had different games that were great. It's sort of like consoles nowadays. Some games are released on every console. Some games are exclusive to various platforms. And that's kind of the point we're at with desktop PC gaming right now. If you want to play the largest number of games, you get a Windows machine, but a lot of great games available for Mac, for Linux. It's fantastic. So it's really not a real reason that Linux sucks at this point. The lack of games is just not an issue anymore. And then non-reason number 5 is audio video stuff. And actually, so that little screenshot right there is OpenShot Video Editor reduced way down to like 50 by 50 pixels. And I was like, hey, that's still recognizable. Anyway, so there was a time when I first started doing these Linux Suck shows where audio video stuff, audio editing, video editing especially, was featured really prominently because I was trying to do a lot of work like I'm doing right here, but it was darn near impossible under Linux. Not impossible, but near. So much so that it cost so much time and frustration to get things working, and oftentimes things just didn't work all that great anyway. And it was maddening. right? It's not that way anymore. I record everything I do under Linux or GNU/Linux or whatever you want to call it. It works great. Almost every single person out there that I know that does YouTube videos and everything else about Linux is now doing them on Linux. That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. I shouldn't say everyone that I know about. All the ones that I interact with are using Linux, right? But that's pretty cool. It's doable, and it's quality. There's the great quality software, Kdenlive and OpenShot and open broadcasting software and everything else. It's just really amazing nowadays. It's not an issue anymore. So with all that out of the way, on to the real reasons why Linux totally sucks right now in 2020, right? So we know why it doesn't. Here's why it does. The first reason I think Linux just blows chunks is Linux backwards compatibility sucks really bad. And when I'm talking about backwards compatibility, I'm talking about the ability to take software built for Linux, say 5, 10, 15 years ago, and run it now. It is a massive headache. Occasionally, you'll run across things that will run. But the more complex your software gets, if you're talking about, well, darn near anything of any reasonable complexity or anything using a GUI, it's not going to run. It's not going to run at all anymore. Other platforms have amazing backwards compatibility. The backwards compatibility on Windows, oh my gosh. I mean, until recently, it was pretty doggone easy to get like 16-bit Windows 3.1.1 applications running on Windows. It was amazing. And getting like an application built for, say, Windows 98 to run on Windows 10, yeah, that's doable. Yeah. Applications built for Windows 2000 and XP, will they run on Windows 10? Heck yeah, at least most of them. That's amazing. Oh, Linux doesn't have that. Doesn't have that at all. In fact, trying to run 10-year-old Linux software is like DLL hell on Windows. You guys know what I'm talking about with DLL hell? That's a phrase that doesn't come up that much anymore. But DLL hell on Windows was a big thing for a long time because Windows used a lot of DLL, dynamic link libraries, right? And you'd have an installer, right? Your application, whether it was a web browser, a game, or a development suite or whatever, would install a bunch of the DLLs that you require for that particular piece of software, whether it's runtime libraries for the development tool sets you use or what have you. And you'll install those DLLs using that installer. Well, then you'll install a different application, but it kind of needs a different version of that same DLL. Oh, you are in for a nightmare. Stuff is going to get real nasty. It's just not good. That's what I'm talking about here. Only our issues on the Linux side are 10 times worse. On the Linux side, we are intrinsically reliant, at least by design for the vast majority of distributions, on online repositories. Those online repositories are grabbing different versions, very specific versions of various libraries in order to support various applications. Now, some applications will be good about that. And we'll say, okay, well, I can handle various versions of that library, between this version and that version or that sort of thing, and still run. Like, okay. But the further out you get 1, 2, 3 years out, things start to get a little shaky. You get 5 to 10 years out, things start getting real shaky to the point where a lot of those applications just don't work anymore. They're reliant on a specific version of a specific library that is no longer included in your repository, so it's very difficult to get. And then that is reliant on a bunch of other libraries, some of which are in the repository but are the wrong version, and some of which aren't in the repository, so you got to build your own versions. It becomes a nightmare, an absolute nightmare, not an insurmountable one, but one where it makes managing a more than a couple year old Linux install awful, just awful. Now I hear what many of you are saying. Well, why are you running older software? Because that's my computer and I want to run whatever software I darn well want to run. If I have a piece of software now and I want to run it 5 years, 10 years into the future, why shouldn't I be able to? Part of the beauty of open source is that the source code is available, therefore it makes it so it's easier to keep software alive. So software doesn't die when someone stops maintaining it, except maintaining the software on Linux and is becoming such a massive challenge. It might as well be closed source half the time, because you're just not going to be able to get it to run in any reasonable amount of time unless you're a developer. And even then, it's going to take a lot of headaches and you're going to break something along the way. Just to give you an example, these games, Civilization Call to Power, Railroad Tycoon 2, and SimCity 3000. These are all games that were ported to Linux. I believe all of them by Loki Games. I'm not sure about the SimCity 3000 one, but I think so. I know Civilization Call to Power and Railroad Tycoon 2 were. Loki was a company that made Linux game ports for a couple of years, and it was awesome because it was the first time we started seeing a lot of commercial Linux games, big titles, the big ones, being ported over to our beloved Linux platform. It was awesome. I own those 3 boxes. I have them. They do not run on any modern Linux system I've tried them on. I managed to get Railroad Tycoon 2 to run after a ton of hard work. And the net result is that system couldn't run hardly anything else. It was just a disaster. It was an epic disaster. So that means that those games, unless I want to specifically have a retro Linux PC with an old version of Linux that never got updated, no repository updates, no distro updates, nothing, in order to run them, they're dead to me. I can't use them. That's what that means. So then that basically means what we're saying is that every couple of years we draw a line in the sand and we say, okay, well, this is that era of Linux. Now, everything before this era, before this line we just drew, everything before that is now a retro computing platform that's completely unsupported, wildly insecure, and unstable. That's what it means. That really, really sucks. That really sucks so, so very much. And it's not just games here. I bring up games because it was cool that we were able to get boxes of video games with Linux, man. Linux binaries on CDs. Awesome. But what about old web browsers? Old games, old anything, old office suites, just tools you need for your job. I say ha. Good luck. Good luck getting them to work if they're more than a couple of years old. And then on the older you get, the harder it gets. If you want software that was made in like the 1990s, let's say the late 90s, to run on your modern Linux machine, oh my. It's going to work sometimes. Sometimes it will work, and sometimes it will be only a tiny bit of work to get it to work. But the majority of the time, it's going to be a hellish nightmarescape. It will be nightmare fuel for every sysadmin. It is awful, just absolutely awful. The thing that gets me, the thing that really gets me, is there are things that help alleviate this. And one of those is called Applmage. Applmage takes all of those dependencies for those old pieces of software and bundles them into a singular ISO file, like you'd use to burn a CD or a flash drive, right? It's called, so you have an appimage.iso, and you double click on it, and it runs that application with all of the old versions of the library specific to that application inside the ISO. So that way you have a single file that you can just distribute around with all, or at least most, certainly the hard to figure out stuff, of the requirements figured out for you. It's fantastic. It's fantastic. It has downsides. I mean, you're bundling all the libraries inside of an ISO, which takes up more space, which I'm not a fan of, but I'm also a fan of being able to run my software, so that's pretty nice. I don't know. In my mind, that fixes a ton of stuff. But here's the thing. Here's the thing that really gets me upset. Major Linux distributions are just ignoring it. And big desktop environments like GNOME and everything are trying to come up with their own solutions, right? Because these problems are not fully solved, really not fully solved, by things like Flatpak and Snappy. They're just not. Some people will claim that they are, but they are not. In practice, it does not work. Appimage solves them. Maybe it doesn't solve some other things, but it solves this. And boy, would it be nice to not have to worry about this. If I could get all those old games like Call to Power and Railroad Tycoon 2 and SimCity 3000 packaged under Applmages, I would be a happy Lunduke. But again, most major Linux distributions are ignoring them. Most Linux developers are not distributing their software that way. A couple are, most are not. It is very, very frustrating. And there is, to my knowledge, only one thing that could possibly explain why people are not adopting this as a format for application distribution. And that is that Linux people are dumb. I'm going to take a sip. Yeah. That's the only thing I was able to come up with, is that Linux people clearly are dumb. And I lump myself in with that. Clearly, I am dumb. Have I been pushing for people to adopt that? I've mentioned it. I should have been pushing. Did the folks at Ubuntu or OpenSUSE or Debian or anyone else, did they push to adopt it? No, they haven't. I mean, at best, you can say, well, app images work well on the vast majority of Linux distributions, so we're done. But we're not. That only takes care of part of the battle. Anyway, so that's number one. Reason number two, and this is a very high level, very heady sort of topic, but we are an operating system, or if you would like to call it that, a collection of disparate operating system chunks that is run by committee. Here's the thing. Nothing good ever comes out of a committee. And I want to make the point here very, very clearly. I'm not saying Linux is bad because there's committees of people involved, but it is. Let's think about this. Here's a visual example. Here's a bunch of me. Here's a bunch of little 8-bit pixel art versions of me. There's one of me standing up top, speaking to all the rest of the dudes, all the other Lundukes, right? There's one head Lunduke and a bunch of sub Lundukes. And the head Lunduke says, let's do this thing. And then all the sub Lundukes are like, all right. And they do it. A singular vision. Everyone working towards a common goal. This is what it would be like run by a committee. All the Lundukes are like, I have equal power. One Lunduke yells, I like systemd. The other Lunduke says, let's bring back unity. Clearly that one's crazy. The other one's like, be like Gentoo. Then one Lunduke, I forgot I put this in here, says, let's just use Active Directory. I forgot I did that. It's true though. Like, if you've ever got a room full of sysadmins or developers working on a project, they need to like come to like some sort of like consensus on. There's always that one person who's like, Active Directory would solve this. Let's use Active Directory. Inevitably. Doesn't matter what the problem is. Like, there's going to be a guy who like working on a project for like, I don't know, like they could be working on the next version of SimCity 7 million or whatever. And then one guy's like, Active Directory really solves a lot of these issues. There's always one Active Directory person. A committee is a group that keeps minutes and loses hours. Milton Berle. If you want to destroy any idea in the world, get a committee working on it. Kettering. It's really hard to design products by focus groups. Steve Jobs. Yeah, I don't often agree with everything Steve Jobs says, but I got to agree with him on this one. What you'll notice when you look around within not just Linux, but all of open source and free software, is that the best projects, the best open source projects, the ones that really stand out to you is like, dang, that's awesome. With a few exceptions, but for the most part, there's always exceptions. But for the most part, the best ones are fiefdoms, ruled over by a singular dictator. Almost inevitably, when there's one person or maybe one or two people sitting at the top and issuing the directions, telling everyone this is the way we're going, this is the vision, this is the goals, this is the future for this project. Those are the ones that you see the biggest advancement on. You see the best marketing work, you see the best design work, you see the best usability, you see the coolest features, you see just the most laser-focused vision. When projects do not operate as a fiefdom, when they do not have a dictator. You know, some projects will have their benevolent dictators, right? Those are the ones that tend to do the best. They have the most success. They have the most, not just success as in they accomplish what they set out to accomplish, but success as in they see success, as in they market share and adoption. But the ones that do not do that, that are fully run by committee, basically, I don't do as well. And here's the thing. We all know this, right? Right. And in a certain sense, this kind of runs counter to the whole open source way of thinking. Like, let's put out the code, man, and we'll all just work on it together, dude. All right. And I love that. All right. I love it. I want to put flowers in my hair and I want to dance around the bonfire when we talk about that too. But I got to be Darth Vader here for a second. We got to search our feelings. We know it to be true. You need a dictator. You just do. But just the same, we keep running most things by committee anyway. We do. Most things end up being run by committee within the open source and free software world. And there is only one reason I can think of why we would look at the successes and the failures within closed source and open source and still do that. And that is that Linux people are dumb. That's the only thing I can think of. What can I do? But here's the thing. Here's the thing. It's way worse than that. It is so much worse than just a huge chunks of the open source and Linuxy world are run by committee. And we're not just talking about the kernel here. We're talking about desktop environments and applications and full distributions and everything else, right? It is so much worse than all of that being run by committee because in general, open source and the Linux ecosystem is not just run by a committee. It's run by a committee that has to please multiple mega corporations. This is reasons why Linux sucks number 3. This is not a joke. This is not a me not liking megacorps because corporations are fine. There's a lot of big giant companies that I actually like and I think that do a pretty darn good job at things. But when you're trying to please a ton of megacorporations all at the same time, there's going to be problems. To spell this out very clearly, here's a short list, a very short list of some of the most prominent sponsors of the Linux Foundation. And I don't mean to call out the Linux Foundation. This is not me trying to bully on them at all. This is just saying that the Linux Foundation pays for the paycheck of Linus Torvalds and some other top Linux kernel maintainers, right? They have a huge amount of control over the direction of Linux. They just do. That's their job. These are companies that pay those bills. AT&T, Google, Huawei, Microsoft, Intel, IBM, Oracle, VMware, Sony, Toyota, Uber, and WeBank, among hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of others, I believe, as certainly quite a few dozen huge ones. And many of them are competing with each other. And many of them have different needs of each other. And many of them have different corporate environments and cultures than each other. And it is problematic when you've got to be able to make them all happy, because if they're paying for your paycheck, you absolutely are going to try to make them happy. Plus, as soon as you bring in mega corporations that your committees kind of have to report to or be involved with. And you see this by the various foundations tending to have a couple of people on the boards for the various foundations from these companies, because those companies paid for those board slots, right? They paid to have that control. So the companies have that control over the various committees, which means that certain things like this happen. Now we have a committee with no one clear dictator yelling things like synergy, best practices, performance metrics, more codes of conduct. And of course, there's still that guy down there in the corner screaming Active Directory, right? I made an Active Directory joke. I forgot about it. And then it amused me when I saw it again. You gotta love a good Active Directory joke. So this is the problem. This is the problem that we're up against is how do you effectively run Linux distributions, Linux desktop environments, Linux application suites, and singular applications, development tool sets, all of it, the kernel itself, as a committee that has to report, in essence, to many megacorps. It's like a multi-headed Hydra beast that you have to report to, but you reporting to them is not you reporting to them. It's you and 50 of your other closest friends who all disagree with each other for the most part, reporting to the same Hydra. That's horrifying. That's just not a thing that functions. Which leads me to number 4. Reason number 4 why Linux sucks is related. We are kind of corporate controlled now, but we are also kind of not. Think about this. We have so many projects, so many teams, so many nonprofits and whatnot that are doing work seemingly independently of the big mega corporations. But a lot of them are funded by the big mega corporations, so they do control and dictate at least some level of what they do. And so many people are like, "Oh, you don't understand the way it's laid out, Lunduke. You don't understand. We take the money from the megacorps, but we don't do what they tell us to do." Right. I'm not buying it at all. Which means that we have, within the broader open sourcey world, especially the Linuxy open sourcey world, all of the drawbacks of being part of a mega corporation, right? The type of speech that we can use has to be compliant with the mega corporation standards, which is a very minor issue, by the way. Just one I bring up. What sort of features you include may or may not help out a competitor. That could be a problem with the corporation. If it doesn't fit into the general corporate philosophy for technology and what should and shouldn't be released and when, and if the companies, these big corporations, are doing things with Linux or related Linux technologies, whether it's GNOME or KDE or Systemd or what have you, and they need to have features put into those systems before they can release a product that uses them. Well, no, they also want to keep their product release plans quiet, but they're also working in open source, and it becomes this big blah. So you have all the drawbacks of being part of a megacorp, but you also still have all the drawbacks of being run by a semi-organized community. And I say semi-organized because while some portions of the Linux and open source and free software communities are amazingly well organized, and it does happen, it really does, and it is beautiful when you see it happen. When you see some of these projects and teams start pulling their stuff together, work of art. Not the normal, not the thing that usually happens. So what usually happens is usually a little bit disorganized. Usually you end up having one group over here that's going to boycott this group over here. Someone's going to go forward with their plans over on route A, and route B, someone's going on some other plans, and maybe there's some conflict, maybe there's not. Hopefully it all just kind of lines up in the end. It's very disorganized, right? It's a disorganized, semi-organized community that's organizing itself roughly by committee, right? That's a lot of negatives. But when you combine that with all the negatives of being run by a mega corporation, there's not a lot of positives left. Now, the only reason I can think of that we would do this is that whole Linux people are dumb thing. So I'm just going to go ahead and say that reason number 5 why Linux sucks is that Linux people are dumb. And again, I'm including me here. I'm going to include me in all this. Because, again, we want to be excellent to each other. We're all in this together. But we're all kind of dumb here. And I'm going to go through a couple of things. The things that I think make us the dumbest now. And some of these you'll have heard before, and some of these might be new. Just a couple of things. Very few. And the first is one that's been talked about a bit, but it's a great example. The executive director of the Linux Foundation, again, they pay the bills for Linus and kernel development, the main kernel maintenance and all that sort of thing, gives presentations about Linux from macOS. Here's a picture. Here's a picture of the 2017 keynote, I believe, of the Open Source Summit, where Jim Zemlin, who is a nice guy. I want to be very clear about this. Jim, you're a nice guy. I don't mean to pick on you, but you're high profile, and it just is such a good example. Where he's given a presentation about how 2017 was the year of the Linux desktop. It's like, that's a good joke, Jim Zemlin. That's a good joke, buddy. But he did it from a Mac. Not just a Mac, but my understanding is a Mac running Mac OS, not a Mac hardware running Linux. Here's the thing with that. We'll start with, doesn't that picture look pretty good considering it's like 140 or whatever by 80? Like that's roughly that picture is scaled down. It kind of makes you look like an old adventure game. That right there is Jim Zemlin, Linux Foundation Executive Director, if he were part of the original King's Quest series. He's all pixelated and awesome. That's rad. Anyway, but what he did there was kind of like being the head of Pepsi, doing a commercial, filming a commercial while drinking a Coca-Cola, right? That's a bad idea, right? That's a real bad idea. And he's not alone, and he's not the only one doing it, and this isn't the only time he's done it either. It's just such a bad idea. And I want to be clear. Use whatever computer you want. I have computers of multiple operating systems around here. I've got old Macintoshes, old DOS machines. I'm not rocking a lot of Windows right now, but I got all sorts of stuff around here, right? It's fine. There's no issue with that. I'm not going to knock on someone for their choice of operating system. But in this case, you kind of have to a little bit. Because we're not just talking about the choice of operating system that Jim Zemlin chooses to run. For that, I want him to have all the freedoms in the world, right? Choose the one he likes or wants to use or is most convenient for him. Great, go with it. But if he's realistically one of the primary spokespeople for an operating system, and he doesn't use that operating system when he's in public, actively at that very second promoting it, we got a problem. We got a big problem there. And again, he's totally not alone. Jim, nice guy. He really is. People should be nice to Jim. He seems nice. I've only met him a couple of times, but he seems like a nice dude. But he's not alone at all. Podcasts galore don't run Linux. Podcasts that talk about Linux don't run Linux. A long time ago, I used to do a series of podcasts that was at one point the biggest Linux podcast there was run from Mac. My partner at the time was so committed to making sure it ran on a Mac that he put together Hackintoshes and all sorts of stuff just so that it could run on a Mac, but definitely not on Linux. Right? And when it wasn't running on a Mac, you know what it ran on? It ran on Windows. I believe it was Windows XP at the time or something like that. This is the truth. Now, do I run everything here on Linux? Yes, I do. And I have for quite a long time. But that's not necessarily the norm. I know a lot of the YouTube video creators and whatnot out there are more and more using Linux, and that's great. But even a lot of the podcasts that are out there, I know for a fact, a ton of the Linux podcasts that talk about Linux and use Linux as their topic, record, edit, and distribute on Macintoshes or Windows PCs. A huge number. And to me, that's ridiculous. It's the Pepsi and Coke issue, right? It's not about what did they choose. I want them to choose whatever they want to choose. They could record their podcast on an Amiga for all I care. In fact, that sounds like a fun idea. I've even joked around how I'd love to just record all my videos on an Amiga and produce them and like take the VHS cassette tapes from an Amiga video toaster and transcode them to an MP4 file, then upload them. Like, that just sounds like fun. Why not? There's nothing wrong with any of that. But when you're promoting something, you kind of need to use the thing you're promoting. And when you go to conferences, there was a period of time when you went to a conference, a Linux conference, everyone ran Mac and Windows. There's this little sea of glowing Apple logos. And for about a year or two, that seemed to change. Like for about a year or two, it seemed to be trending the other way. Like I'd go to conferences and I'd see increasing numbers of Linux laptops. I'm like, this is great. We finally are getting out of that glut we were in, that little where all the Linux developers were running Macs, right? It just was the case. Oh my gosh, was it the case? And then it went right back. You go to O'Reilly's OzCon or the Southern California Linux Expo, and you sit in the audience and you look around at the laptops, and my heavens, I mean, there are some ThinkPads, but some of them are running Linux. It's true. There's some System 76 and Purism and some Dells, and you find a good number of machines that maybe they didn't ship with Linux but are running it now. They're definitely there. But I'd say far beyond the 20%-ish market share that Mac OS currently holds, way beyond that is how many people are running Mac OS at those conferences, at Linux conferences. Man, they just use Macs like nobody's business. And here's the thing. Here's the thing that gets me with that. It is really hard to develop or promote software that you yourself refuse to use. I know a lot of people working on and developing, in some cases as a hobby, in some cases paid, varied, but developing a lot of very high profile Linuxy software that do the vast majority of their development on a Mac, running Mac OS, sometimes Linux in a virtual machine. It's really hard to do that. And not because it's technically hard, but because if you're not living in and dogfooding the thing that you're developing, it's really hard to know what people are suffering through with your software. It's hard to make great software until you are using it every day. It's hard to promote and market that software unless you are actively using it. I know so many people that work in marketing at Linux companies, at open source companies, that do not use Linux at all. Can barely install Linux. Not a joke. Use Windows or Macs, and that's it. Diehards, right? And those are the people who are going to be actively promoting and marketing Linux. That doesn't work. Those people are just not doing what they need to do their jobs. It's just not. If I went to work at Microsoft, and Microsoft's like, Lunduke, you got to market the heck out of Windows. We're seeing a little bit of a dip. Mac OS is taking some of our market share. We want to win back those, that 5-10% that they took from us. I'm like, okay, well, clearly I need to sit down and use Windows because I haven't been using Windows in years. I cannot effectively market Windows from Linux. It's not doable. I've got to use Windows for that. Same deal here, folks. But again, and the only reason that we wouldn't be running the operating system that we're developing or marketing or promoting or talking about is if we're dumb. I can't think of any other reason. One other thing that just really gets me is that we kick out of our community anyone we disagree with. This just happens regularly lately. And this includes our founders, man. Our founders. And I've got tons of examples here, but I want to narrow this down. We recently forced the removal of Richard Stallman from the Free Software Foundation. Now, Richard Stallman technically resigned, but his hand was forced, and the Free Software Foundation's hand was forced as well. A mob rose up and went on the attack against Richard Stallman, the guy who's behind the GPL, the GNU, the GNU/Emacs, and all those sorts of things. And the mob went after him. Now, what's interesting is the mob went after him, and I'm not going to get into the details about it, but the mob went after him for things that I've criticized him for in the past, to his face and publicly. But the mob decided to take up the pitchforks and the torches and chase after the monster and get him out of the Free Software Foundation. At least that's how they viewed it, I think. Same thing was going on with the Linux kernel. A lot less success, but the top dog at the Linux kernel, Linus himself, he went on a month-ish long, hiatus in order to see like a therapist or something because he was mean to people or something like that. I don't mean to downplay anyone's thoughts around any of this. But there was not just an effort to get Linus removed from the kernel, but other Linux kernel maintainers and developers as well. Long-standing ones that have been working on it for decades. People who I would consider to be founders of the Linux world. Key neckbeards. Even though a lot of them don't have neckbeards, but key neckbeards. And the open source initiative. The open source initiative is fascinating because it was founded by two guys, really. One of those guys was banned and the other one quit in disgust. Yeah. That's what we're doing with our founders. The people who started all of this. The open source movement, the free software movement, the Linux kernel, all of it. That's what we're doing to them. It makes so many people feel so unsafe. It makes them feel like a mob could break out and come for them at any moment for saying anything. The mobs have attacked me plenty of times. It's awful. It makes people not want to be part of the Linux community. It makes people afraid to be a part of the Linux community and still be an honest person and talk at all. Just use words or have opinions. Oh, heavens to Betsy, heaven help you if you have a political opinion. And we're not even talking about going on to a mailing list and spouting your political opinion in an off-topic way. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about going to a conference, getting up on stage, grabbing the mic and saying, you got to vote for this person or anything like that. Nothing like that. I'm saying there have been people who have been banned from Linux conferences. We think because they had one tweet one time where they talked about liking one candidate or another. This has happened. And I've reached out to the organizations that have done that. And what have they done in response? They won't return my calls. Ever. For months on end. Nay, years at this point for some of these issues. And it just seems to be getting worse. We have mobs. Big, friendly mobs who are coming to kill you at all times. Now, a case could be made that some of this sort of thing is happening outside of the Linux world as well. And that's fine. But I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about this is here. You're right here, right now, us. Building open source solutions, building free software, making the Linux world more awesome, more inclusive of friendship. Right? Let's include friendship for a change. And just being nice to each other, being excellent to each other. And right now, a lot of people have been leaving the Linux community because of that fear. And yeah, that is a thing that's happening. And I think that's going to escalate. And that's terrifying. So when you combine all those things together, combine all that together into one big thing. What does this mean? What is the grand takeaway? What are we? What is the Linux community with all this going on? So I thought about it. And I thought, what defines the Linux community? And this is what I came up with. The Linux community is a corporate-controlled committee of people who don't use Linux and dislike ideas. That's what I came up with. We ban people for having ideas, even if they founded all of this. The Free Software Foundation and Linux and open source stuff and licenses, everything. We'll just ban them. We'll just ban them outright. They had ideas and their ideas were not the right ideas, so we have to ban them. We are corporate controlled, but we are also committee controlled, which is a really weird thing to be, but it's the truth. That's what we have. We have an open source committee of corporate financed and controlled people who, when you go to the conferences, by and large, they're not running Linux. The people making the decisions aren't running Linux. The people on the committees, some of them run Linux. A lot of them don't. The people in the audiences, some of them run Linux, a lot of them don't. So by and large, can I say that they are people that use Linux? No, I can't. It seems more obvious that they don't use Linux. So we are a corporate controlled committee of people who don't use Linux and dislike ideas. Is that really what we are, though? Because it looks like that. It looks like that is what we are exactly. If you remove yourself, back yourself up, 1,000-foot view. You're not in the Linux community, right? Wipe away everything you know about Linux and open source and GPL toolsets, everything. Just wipe it out of your brain. And you're like, okay, I'm going to close my Windows 10 Surface Pro laptop, put it off to the side. Oh, look at that Linux community over there. Well, they're banning everyone that founded them. Okay. And I went to this Linux conference once, and I didn't see anyone who wasn't using a Mac, and they did all the presentations on a Mac. And then I went and listened to a few Linux podcasts that were all recorded on a Mac, so they don't use Macs. And oh, look at this. They were sponsored by a lot of big companies. And there's nothing wrong, again, with big companies. Big companies are fine. I like big companies. I do a lot of work with big companies. I've worked at some great big companies that I really like. Some of them people would feel like don't like free software, but I still really liked working for them. That's a thing. But that's really what it is. A corporate-controlled committee of people who don't use Linux and dislike ideas. Is that who we are? Heavens to Betsy. That's horrible. That's a horrible thing to be. And here's the thing. If that is not who we are, because that's what it looks like from the outside, maybe we should find a way to stop that stuff. Maybe we should find a way to be organized a little bit better, so it's a little less make fun of people. Maybe we should find a way to make sure people who are making decisions about Linux are using Linux, right? Maybe we should find a way where we encourage each other in a friendly, positive, helpful way to use more Linux on our desktops, on our laptops, especially when we're out in public making a big deal about doing Linuxy stuff, like when we're at a Linux conference, right? Let's help each other with that. Maybe we should do that. Maybe, you think? If all of that bums you out, if all of that is just like, dude, Lunduke, that is a massive, massive bummer. There's nothing fun there. To you, I say this. Chin up. Have a stiff upper lip and all that. And just remember, at least Linux backwards compatibility really sucks. So we've got that going for us. This has been Linux Sucks for the year of our Lord 2020. I hope everyone is having a fantastic quarantine wherever you're at. I hope your life is good. I hope Linux is doing awesome 1 year from now. And I hope in 2021, when I stand on a stage somewhere and tell everyone all the reasons why Linux sucks, it can mostly be about System D. And all these things that I just talked about will hopefully, fingers crossed, be really far in the rearview mirror. Until then, I say to you, adieu, and be excellent to each other. All right. Thanks, everybody.